Afternoon, and we have an assembled quite a crew of folks here to talk about today. How should central bank conflicts be managed? Professor Charles Goodhart, the emeritus professor at LSE, famous, of course, for Goodhart's Law, of which I am a great admirer. Professor William Booter, an economic advisor of great renown, coming and dialing in from America. Dr. Andrew Hilton, one of my favorite friends who loves combating with me about these things, from the London Institute of Banking and Finance, and Dr. Shan Turnbull, who is with the International Institute for Self-Governance. Normally, Shan would be dialing in from Australia, but by a lovely coincidence, he is right next door here to me in another area of the studio. So it's going to be quite an interesting session today. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it is my privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars on a vast range of topics because of the tolerance and generosity of our sponsors. And they are always interested in just about anything to do with technology, economics, and finance. And today, well, we're certainly talking about economics and finance when we talk about central banks. But Shan contends that we may be on the edge of a new era where we could, in fact, tie possibly our currencies and coinage to other technological means and indices. But we'll be exploring that as we go ahead. For me, I think we live in an interesting era, and that this webinar may be coming at a particularly odd time, just as central banks go from the boredom of this great age of moderation to the terror and fun and thrills of the roller coaster ride that we seem to be exhibiting, whether it's the heavy looming inflation as it climbs very sharply upwards, or whether it's wars in Ukraine or geopolitical conflict or trade. So do they have too much to do? And we seem to be talking about our central banks being required to look at inflation as their primary target, growth as their primary target, employment as their primary target, equity amongst people and distribution and financial inclusion, climate change. Why aren't they issuing central bank digital currencies immediately? And then they're supposed to be involved with sanctions. There's a heck of a lot for a central bank to do. And tempting as it is to invoke poetry, it is pretty frightening and scary. Now, just to get things off to a really quick start, Peter in the background is going to be issuing our first quick poll. What is the most important future item on central banks' agenda? Is it A, intervening in financial markets, B, tackling inequality, C, combating climate change, D, introducing digital currencies, or E, reacting to geopolitics? We got quite a few people online, but gentlemen in the panel, as ever, our audience is quite opinionated and very fast at voting, as over half of them have voted already. We're moving on up into the 70% mark. I'll leave the poll open for just a second. And I think we're ready to show the results, Peter. Well, here you go. With most of the audience having voted, you can see that 31% believe that the job is to intervene in financial markets. A third think it's about tackling inequality, and a third it's about reacting to geopolitics. Interestingly, particularly given the many pontifications of speakers at FS Club and questions from our audience, combating climate change, despite Mark Carney and Annie Haldane's work, is below 10% at 9% there. So intervening in financial markets, tackling inequality, and reacting to geopolitics, that's what you, the audience, think should be going on. But it's enough from you and it's enough from me. Our job today is to have a quick round robin of some opening remarks on the subject. We'll be going through each of our panelists in turn, and we've reserved a good 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers and closing statements as the debate goes. 3 quick points. Yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be up in approximately 2 working days, so you can watch it over the weekend. Secondly, the slides and such as things are available will be posted in the meeting area, and you can go and access those. And finally, how do you participate in the Q&A? Well, I'm here with you. I will be happy to feed questions sent in through the GoToWebinar question and answer facility. If you send them in that way, that's great. Please don't try and email me, text me, WhatsApp me, whatever, because as I say, I'm here with you. All of your questions will be sent to all of the panelists with your email attached, and they can answer directly. So if you wish to contact any one of them, just simply say, would Shan please give me a buzz about some comment he made, or would Andrew please provide substantive? We will get all of that to them. So we have a wonderful panel today, and I'm afraid I'm just going to be quite dull and boring and take it in turn. So if I could, first questions, with first comments, over to you, Charles. What are your thoughts on the subject today?
Well, you set out a list of objectives for the central bank, but you forget that the central bank does not have goal independence. What it is supposed to do is set forth by the government, and in fact, historically, the central bank's prime objective has been to support the government of the day as best it can. Now, under normal circumstances, the primary requirement for that is to achieve price stability. But when you've got a real crisis, and wartime is a real crisis, then that goes by the board. It might technically be possible to achieve price stability, but when there is a real crisis, wartime, the greatest need is to maintain national sovereignty and to maintain control over the economic system as a whole. One of the features of a central bank is that it is part of a political system, and the overall requirements are imposed on it by the political authorities, and the political authorities will require the central bank to do what they want it to do.
Fantastic. Willem, over to you then. What are your thoughts on the topic?
Thank you. One issue raised is whether money should be tethered to a sustainability index to correct market failures that created climate change. I assume that tethering would mean that the central bank should target a price index that values real goods and services in terms of their true scarcity value, allowing for the externalities, the public good dimensions. But that itself doesn't correct the market failure, right? Correcting the market failures that create climate change will require fiscal policy, regulation, possibly international redistribution. Central banks have a very minor negligible role to play in that. They should focus on price stability in terms of a properly defined price index, yes, and on financial stability, the main objectives. Second point, technology, indeed, tokenized e-money can replace central bank money as a means of payment and medium of exchange. But the central bank remains essential as lenders last resort and market makers last resort, being able to create legal tender at will in order to preserve financial stability. Self-liquidating money, well, there are occasions when negative interest on money is desirable, right? That's when we are at the effective lower bound and need negative nominal interest rate to stimulate the economy, but permanently negative interest rates on currency are not desirable. The optimal quantity of monetary is very clear on that. So I'll stop at that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Willem. I'd like to turn, if I could, to you, Andrew. Your thoughts.
Okay, well, mine not so wonderful, but let me start by saying that Shan Turnbull actually circulated a couple of papers that he had written. And I have to confess I didn't really understand them, but they were very much in terms of increasing the goals that central banks should have when setting policy rates. And I am one of those who feels that the fewer goals it has, the clearer the goals it has. And, you know, let's not mess with adding a climate change target to them. But he also said, okay, if you don't understand what I'm saying, look at what Mark Carney was saying in 2019 at the Jackson Hole Symposium. That was a very interesting speech that he gave. It got a huge amount of publicity at the time. I only read the cliff notes, but since then I've actually read the whole thing, and I'm surprised. First of all, he criticizes I think very trenchantly the existing currency system, which he says the dominance of the dollar, particularly reduces the shock absorption of floating exchange rates. It drives down interest rates in general. It reinforces the spillover from US economic problems to the rest of the world, and it hits the emerging markets harder than anyone else. I don't think one can disagree with that. It is a sort of formal presentation of the blindingly obvious. But the final quarter of the paper has to do with his proposals for a synthetic hegemonic currency, SHC. And that, I think, is what Shan in particular was focusing on, and what I thought that perhaps Michael, with his technology bent, would also be focusing on. I think this is really rather interesting, because the speech as I read it isn't the speech as it was reported. In fact, Mark Carney seems to be thinking that a systemic hegemonic currency will be a transition to a multipolar system. And he seems to prefer a multipolar system for a multi-currency world. And also one has to ask what really is different from the SDR. His proposal for a synthetic currency is effectively the SDR. The SDR is a digital currency. There aren't trucks going around with lots and lots of SDRs in them. And that brings us to the whole question of digital currencies, and whether digital currencies can actually make a difference. Central bank digital cash is obviously a huge issue at the present time, but I note from the Bank of England's, actually the CDC, the working group on central bank digital currencies, on its very first page says we already have a digital currency for wholesale markets. All we're really talking about is digital currency for retail markets. So is that going to be a big difference? And, you know, when we look at what technology can do, well, obviously it can do a huge amount, but there are vested interests that are going to stop it. If it stopped the SDR, or it stopped the IMF from making the SDR the currency of choice for the rest of the world, I can't really see that central bank digital cash is going to have very much more success from that. As for tethering, which is the other issue, well, we tried it with the gold standard. We've had proposals for doing it for a basket of currencies, but the whole thing depends on cooperation, and cooperation is seriously lacking. How you get it, particularly in this new environment, which is very, very different to the pre-pandemic environment, very, very different to the pre-Ukraine environment, I don't know. My thoughts.
Thank you very much. Some interesting opening remarks. I might come back as well to Charles and Willem about their thoughts on Mark Carney's paper. But before I do so, Shan, the floor is yours, and you were really the instigator of this, saying we ought to have this discussion a few months back. So over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Andrew. This week, readers at the Financial Times learned from Martin Wolf that cryptocurrencies is not the financial system that we want, and he pointed out to get credibility, cryptocurrencies tether themselves to official money. But official money is not tethered to anything, and that is the point of concern, because Lord Stern advised the UK government 16 years ago that the present monetary system has created the biggest market failure the world has ever seen to create climate change. So we're using the wrong sort of money because nobody has defined what economic value is. And it's poisoning and degrading the atmosphere, the oceans, the soils, and so on. And so I see the role of central banks need to reinvent themselves and reinvent the nature of money, so that it does not become a unit of value or account, but it's simply a medium of exchange indexed to a sustainability index, because nobody's defined economic value. And economic value has no utility if there's no humans on the planet. And we're not going to have any humans on the planet unless we stop climate change and counter it. And the present currency is responsible for that market failure. And by having a sustainability index, which could be automatically calculated on a 5-year running average of the total renewable consumption of goods and services and exports as a percentage of total. And the closer you got to 100%, the closer you got to a circular economy to sustain humanity for eternity. So my concern is very much focused on climate change, of adopting a tether for money to give it credibility and stability, reduce the cost of the financial system, by being self-liquidating to save humanity. Thank you.
Great. Just quickly, Charles and Willem, you've heard Andrew's take on Mark Carney's Jackson Hole speech of 2019. Do you view it pretty much the same way?
I can't remember it, so I pass it over to Willem.
I think I broadly agree with that. He clearly doesn't like the hegemonic dollar and would like to see, I think, a gradual movement towards a multipolar currency world where optimal currency areas would each focus their own appropriate price stability index. This is very different from what Sean appears to have in mind, right? There was no reference in Mark Carney's to the present currency arrangement, monetary arrangement, being responsible for the market failure that undermines human sustainability through climate change and global warming. I mean, those, I think, I would say, indeed, central banks have no responsibility for that. This is fiscal, social, regulatory, organizational, political problems that cause the true scarcity value of real economic resources not to be priced properly. Central banks should be given minimal mandates, financial stability and price stability, and that's pretty well it. Climate change is a fiscal and regulatory issue.
Okay, well, we seem to have a relative panel unanimity, certainly amongst Andrew, William, and Charles, that price stability is probably the primary thing. Question from you, Cursor. So historically, have central banks been good at price stability and as a market regulator? Can I have a quick show of hands of those who think yes? Shan, Andrew, Willem, and Charles, have they been good?
Oh.
Okay, we got a 3/4 from Shan. Andrew?
Well, define good, I suppose, is the answer. I mean, as I think it was Willem who said, from time to time, central banks don't actually want low inflation because, as Charles was saying, they respond to political events. And it just so happens that I realize at the moment that central banks, and particularly the Fed and the FOMC, are absolutely adamant in their fight against inflation. But inflation is actually really rather convenient when you've got massive debts out there. Only inflation will probably drive them down to manageable levels. So, you know, but not yet.
And there are times, as Charles pointed out, sorry.
One of the questions I would like to ask Shan is, how can you have a medium of exchange which is not a good store of value? I don't understand that. And I understand how you can try to have a currency board system which is linked to some measure of inflation. But I would point out that our measures of inflation are extremely uncertain because it is very difficult to take into account new innovations and quality changes. And one of the reasons why the target was set at 2% rather than at 0 was that the inflation indices that we have really don't, and to some large extent, can't take into account quality changes and innovations. We didn't have things like Zoom or webinars 5 years ago, and they've made an enormous difference to the way we interact, as this meeting very clearly of itself indicates. So that the idea that there is some sort of perfect measure of inflation is just not true. All measures of inflation are to a degree dubious, and you have to try roughly to choose the best Whether we have chosen the best, I think, is very uncertain.
Well, we're going to have a quick break as we take another poll there, Shan. We'll come back in that. But Peter's about to launch another quick poll just to get the audience tenor on this one. So, folks, how do you feel? Should economic value be not defined, which Shan would maintain is the current sort of situation, defined by the central government or its central bank, defined by the IASB of all people, or defined by some sort of index of sustainability? There you go. Peter, how's that coming along?
None of the above.
Okay. So we have the audience answering. Polls there. As ever, folks are pretty opinionated here, and well over half the audience have voted. I'll leave that open for just a few more seconds, and we can close that poll and display the results. So we have 44% say just leave it undefined, 32% actually want to define it by an index of human sustainability, 16% by the government, and 8% by the IASB. I'm surprised the IASB is that high, but let's not go there. Anyway, we come back to having a look at things. So tethering. So we spoke earlier about the synthetic hegemonic currency, as Mark Carney had. Personally, guys, I have a problem. Everything you do is a tether. You know, CPI is a tether. Trevor Hilder here is saying, should central banks target asset price inflation, another form of inflation? We've had, as Andrew points out, the SDR, which isn't tethering to them, but it's at least close to, I think, what Carney's talking about. And Andrew Hilton, of all people, remember the WOKU, the World Currency Unit, from 22 years ago. Sorry?
Define your terms. What do you mean by tether?
Exactly. Is it something along the lines of that the units are roughly at some sort of level of parity, or a multiple that's fixed over long periods of time?
Was the gold standard a tether? Was the gold standard a tether?
It could well have been if you said that ounces of gold were equal to something else. So
we did.
But equal, sorry, do you mean that they have to be exchangeable on demand into whatever it is tethered to? Because that would make a broad sustainability index like a bit of a problem as a tether, because I can't buy 2 ounces of environmental sustainability. I really think we have to simply have central bank target the best broad cost of living approximation that it can cook up, and target its stability as their overriding macroeconomic objective. Financial stability is, of course, an even more important objective. And as Charles points out, there may be times, like war times, that its fiscal potential through seigniorage can become dominant and overcome even the price stability mandate. But I don't think that tethering to an environmental index means anything.
What is an index of sustainability? I've never seen anything, and I'm rather like Willem. I don't believe that it is actually feasible to produce an index of sustainability. And these indices, they change all the time. What maybe seems sustainable at one point will seem less sustainable at another. And after all, in a few decades, populations are going to start declining.
Shan, I think the question for you: how would you construct a sustainability index?
Well, scientists can identify what is sustainable consumption or exports and what are not sustainable. And I agree it could change over time with technology. But if we want to sustain humanity on this planet and preserve the environment, sustainability trumps inflation concerns. And so inflation is irrelevant if you don't have humans here. So for existential reasons, we got to use the best sustainability indexes that we can. And there's very simple ones, simply the consumption of renewable energy as a percentage of all consumption of energy. Those sort of statistics and data are available now. Now the index wouldn't be redeemable in anything, as William was asking. The index would be is not a store of value. And to answer Charles's question, he didn't understand how you stop money being a store of value. And William's got the answer to that. It's self-liquidating money that was issued in hundreds of communities in the Great Depression. It was called stamp script. The sale of the stamps redeemed the money. It was self-redeeming, and that allows decentralized banking, democratizing finance, because money is only created when it's self-liquidating, as Keynes suggested it should be. It's just used as a medium of exchange, and it's no longer a unit of value or a store of value. You've simplified money. Keep it simple, sweetheart. And you've simplified, reduced the cost of the financial system, which have doubled over the last this century, from less than 5% of GDP, and their financial system is now costing over 20% of GDP. We've got financialization. Money, the whole financial system is too complicated. It's dysfunctional. It is creating market failure, which is generating climate change and destruction of the environment. We've got to get our priorities straight. The fact you don't know how to do it at the moment, that's why the central banks need to reinvent themselves to save humanity. We're issuing who else is going to redesign our money system? Martin Wolf is suggesting we don't have the money system that we need now at the moment, and cryptocurrencies are not their answer. We've got to find an answer to sustainability. Get the priorities right. Thank you.
Well, let me push this a bit. Willem, I think, makes a very important point that we have to distinguish between backing and maybe tethering in terms of nominal value. But I can tell from the audience there's even some skepticism about that. So if we're going to have some type of a sustainability index of, where you've got it, we have some questions here. So Nikki Holtzhausen has a question for you, Shan. What are your views on a global balance sheet incorporating assets and liabilities such as environmental rehabilitation liabilities? That's the sort of level she thinks you might need to go to.
Not at all.
Gregory McCain says, can these certain things actually have an absolute objective value that remains constant and high? Water, air quality, public health, or do these values change over time? Which I would say. So, quick response.
Value is irrelevant. Sustainability is. Value is not definable. We've got to forget about value. Elinor Ostrom said wicked economic problems can be solved without markets or state. And that's what we've got to rely on.
Okay. Well, we've got a lot of these questions here.
What you want the central bank to do is really what the government ought to do. And the central bank is a creature of the government. And what its objectives are set for it by government. You keep on saying that central banks ought to be changing. It's governments who have to deal with climate change, not central banks. That's a point that I think all of us are trying to make.
Yes.
Yeah, but central banks control the currency. Central banking is but a specialized form of central planning, and we know that doesn't work. We need decentralized money according to the sustainability of each bioregion of the world, and then you'd solve the border problem of relative values between national currencies. It'll be determined by the sustainability of those geographical areas.
You've got to get governments to agree to that. And the currency is a part, it's called seigniorage, and it is related to the power of government. And you can't deal with these kind of issues without taking into account politics and governments.
Oh, I agree. I fully agree with you there, Charles. And that's what I'm suggesting, that central banks ought to reinvent both themselves and the currency to sustain humanity.
But we could have central banks perfectly sort of targeting a true cost of living index that represents sustainable consumption rather than actual consumption, right? Assume that that's a target. And you could still have the economy going to hell, because it doesn't remove the externalities. Just because you stabilize the price of something doesn't mean that the real quantities of goods and services consumed cannot be on an unsustainable downward path. So I really think that we are barking up the wrong tree when we're looking at central banks to play any kind of material role in the climate change debate. As financial regulators, they have to, of course, look at the financial risks posed by climate change, both the physical risks and the the risk through the response of the private and public sector to climate change. But they should not be viewed as having any material impact on long-run human sustainability.
Isn't that the
I
point?
agree with your concerns, and I think you need a sandbox to experiment.
Look, central banks, I mean, clearly central banks have two roles. One is pure central banking, and the other is financial regulation. Financial regulation can be taken out of the central bank and run as an independent body. And whether it's right or wrong, Mark Carney decided to include climate change into the fundamental rules behind financial regulation. Fine. But central banking is a pure discipline, and that has to do with the goals that the government sets for the central bank. In most cases, that's inflation. In some cases, it's a dual mandate. But in no case is there a mandate that includes improving climate change. At least I would hope not.
I'm suggesting that's how they reinvent themselves.
Well, I think, Shan, what people are trying to point out is that you can't use central bank as a hand-waving tool for the entire system. They have a defined role, and and their role is not the creation of the currency; it's the management of it. And as Charles, I think, is saying, it's within an environment of tight political constraint. But let's move on to some of those constraints. Trevor Hilder wonders. I thought central banks were supposed to be politically independent, but several speakers here are clearly saying they are not and cannot be. I believe that's kind of what three are saying. Is that correct?
Not cannot be.
Yes.
Central banks are creatures of the state, right? So that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that means they do what they're told. If they're told to be independent, they're independent.
Yes.
They, as Stan Fisher pointed out, they were given instrument independence. They do not have goal independence. What the central bank is supposed to do is set out in a instruction from the Minister of Finance, or in the case of the ECB, an instruction that is set out in the treaty setting up the ECB.
Now, there's an interesting point, Andrew, you raised it, Mark Carney's speech in the SHC. He was, to some degree, tackling the hegemony of the US dollar. Question here for everybody from Bob McDowell. De-dollarization is a realistic movement. How do you suggest Western banks address this? Should they let it happen? Should they encourage it?
It's largely the way that markets work. It's not entirely within the remit of any central bank to undertake de-dollarization or more dollarization. The development of CBDCs could, in theory, I think, reduce the extent of dollarization. Whether that would be the case in practice, we've yet to see. But one of the reasons why CBDC has such potential merit is because the foreign exchange markets don't work very well, in the sense that it costs a huge amount of money to actually transfer from one currency to another.
just putting up another poll that to take a sounding from the audience on basically should money be used as a medium of exchange, be mostly created by private banks, which is kind of the current situation, central banks, which is where things are going by on the CBDC movement, only by the government, or using various types of credit creation or script on goods and services. And whilst the audience is voting on that, I'd like to point out an interesting comment from Susan Milton you might like to react to. Susan's not convinced that money is at fault. It just represents market activity. Fiat currency acts as a stable tether against which economic activity is measured. But she does agree that environmental issues do trump inflation in the longer term. So do you actually believe we can tether sustainability to currency? And I got clearly in this case, it's 3 out of 4 the other way. But anyway, the audience has given their thoughts on this, and they're very keen, with 36% saying the central bank should be the issuer of money as a medium of exchange, 25% private banks is the current system, which puts well over half into the CBDC bit, 18% by the government, and 20% using by producers and or consumers. So it's fairly balanced there, but nevertheless, over a third of the audience believe it's a central bank issuance, to answer Shan's strict question. So we're there. Good. Well, in terms of moving this discussion a little bit further forward, Jeff Kroc points out that as well as setting interest rates, central banks are very active in the market for government debt. Does the extensive holdings of debt, which are either owned by governments or required to pay any surplus to government, essentially amount to zero debt? And aren't we really going to be looking ahead at trying to rid our economies of huge debts in excess of GDP, which is unrepayable? In other words, inflate our way out of it. And we have another question here, which I think is related to this. Before we answer, I might go to Charles and Willem and then Andrew. And I'm just trying to find the question here. It's really got to do with the housing crisis. You know, we've got a huge housing crisis away, and don't central banks need to inflate the way out of that one as well? So we've got a big debt overhang. We've got a housing market which has been bubbling for a while. How can central banks deal with this? Charles, thoughts?
You say we've got a housing crisis. In what sense? I mean, housing prices have been going up. I mean, housing prices, I think, are too high. The question is, can we return to a more appropriate relationship between incomes and housing prices without having a crash in the housing market that would cause a crisis? And I think that that is a very pertinent question for today. I'm not sure how the central banks are going to be able to get the present surge of inflation under control without raising interest rates to a point at which we may very easily have something like a crisis in the housing market. The crisis isn't yet. It potentially is coming in future. I would like to make one comment about the money being created by the central bank. The problem with that is, what is the counterpart of that money going to be? Because the counterpart of money that is privately produced by the commercial banks is quite largely lending to the private sector. And the question then is, do you want the central bank to undertake lending to the private sector? And I think most people then rather draw back from that. Would you have, are those who want the central bank to issue money, is the central bank then going to shift funds to the commercial banks to do the lending to the private sector? The issue about, you cannot divorce the issue of who issues money from the issue of who lends to whom. So you've got to look at both sides of the balance sheet, not just the money creation side.
Willem, any thoughts on the need to manage both debt and housing price landing?
Well, it's very hard to see a soft landing with house prices in the US, in the UK, in much of continental Europe also, having risen so much relative to income, sustainable at zero policy rates, unlikely to be sustainable with policy rates at 4% plus wherever they go to. So, and I can't see a painless way of getting around that. This will be a housing market price implosion, and hopefully we will, since house prices haven't been quite as leveraged as they have been in, say, 2007-8, that we can avoid a wider financial crisis. On the issue of government debt sustainability, historically, the kind of debt to GDP ratios, public debt to GDP ratios that we're seeing now have been followed by periods of material inflation. And part of, in other words, of the amortization of the debt was through unanticipated inflation. And we may well see that again. It all depends, I think, what the longer term interest rate environment real is going to be like. If we go back to 0 to 0.5% neutral real rate, debt, public debt that would not have been sustainable in the past may be sustainable without producing a sharp spike in inflation. If we go back to higher neutral real rates, I think debt sustainability is going to be a problem throughout the advanced industrial countries, not to mention emerging markets. Sorry, this was too long.
Well, I thank William and Charles for their answers, because they support my view that the present system is not fit for purpose. You get this impossible situation of excess debt and using only interest rates to create more inflation, to create more problem in the housing market. They're just unsolvable questions. We need a new type of financial system, and cryptocurrencies don't provide the answer. We need to change the nature of money.
Shan, you can't just wipe out where we are. You cannot wipe out history by saying we need a new currency. We are where we are, and we have to move forward from here.
I agree. And that's why I need a sandbox to experiment of different financial systems.
Andrew, I think you wanted to make a comment there.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say we have unprecedented levels of debt. We have we're coming out of a very difficult period in this country. We're going to have a chancellor, if he's there tomorrow, who is going to announce more borrowing for more spending, because allegedly more borrowing for more spending is going to help the cost of living, drive down the cost of living, if the government is to be believed. I can't see a happy ending to this, because I can only see that the only way we're going to get a handle on inflation is a handle on debt is by higher inflation, and I can't see at the present time that interest rates are still deeply negative in real terms. The housing, I mean, the average mortgage, the 30-year mortgage in the US is 5.8%. That's a 30-year mortgage at a time when the inflation rate is what, 8.7%. So, you know, they're giving money away. So I can't see for a moment that the housing bubble is going to burst anytime soon. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when the pop comes, it's going to be an even bigger pop. So, you know, not a happy prospect, I would have thought. So to that extent, I share Shan's apocalyptic vision, but I don't share his solution to it.
Well, Lord King says we're sleepwalking into a financial disaster in his book.
Well, the audience tackling it as it is seems to be coming up with three almost distinct areas. So Nikki Holzhausen and a few others are trying to flesh out a sustainability balance sheet of stable value in line with Shan. We've got another group, I would say, led by Andrew Purvis. If it all comes crashing, the government can effectively nationalize the land, resell it back, and solve the housing crisis through a land value tax. It's a complicated entry here, which I'll send to all of you, but it is an interesting point. And very in line with Silvio Gazelle and others, if you really want to poke at it, who Keynes said the world has more to learn from Silvio Gazelle than from anybody else. And then finally, we've got another group here pointing out, sort of led by Jeff Kroc, that actually at the end of the day, this debt is owed to ourselves. The central bank money is funding government expenditure and doesn't need to be accounted for as debt, so we could cancel it all out. So lots of interesting thoughts there from the audience, but we'll just take a quick one. And I think we have a view here again on the panel that the central banks are political constructs, and the question that underpins, I think, much of this, the title for the webinar was who should manage central bank conflicts arising from some of these issues. And I'll just take a quick audience poll on that one as we go. So do you think it should be pretty much self-managed and as independent as they are, which I love Andrew's point, they're independent if they're told to be. Should it be a chancellor finance minister? In others, a little bit more direct control. Should it be, as a lot of people have been moaning, I'm thinking of Radix here in the UK, who keeps claiming it should be some direct legislative control, some kind of independent entity, or some weird combination of the above, which gives you some idea of my feelings. But while the audience is answering that, we've again got over half the audience have answered, and I think we're also coming up a bit muddled here. I'll just close that and share the poll results there. And what we have here is over a third think some combination of the above, which is probably a good mishmash of things. Whilst 22% think it should be by the finance minister, split 17% on self-managed or an independent loyal opposition, but only 9% by some committee of the legislature. So those are the sorts of thoughts of the audience. And I guess a last point here, really touching on central bank digital currencies, because we have no more polls, which is good. I'd like to just have a thought here from the audience. How much can technology replace a central bank? And you're not talking about cryptocurrencies, but very much about the idea of a central bank digital currency. I have to point out repeatedly to people that virtually every central bank report on the subject has pointed out we are definitely not using consensus mechanisms, and we don't see the point in using a distributed ledger or blockchain. So these are just central banks allowing us either to bank directly with them at a retail level. So in the case of the United Kingdom, 65 independent accounts potentially, leaving a big question about what happens to fractional reserve banking. Do we try and maintain that? The banks would claim we need to keep the credit flowing and therefore need to let them have that intermediary role. Other people would say, well, we just create more credit and put that into the system, and they would have to move back to being much more the idea of an asset management outfit and not have their roles. So I'm kind of curious, how far should we be relying on technology? And I'll throw it open if I can. I'll start with you, William, if I may. Willem, did you?
What exactly would you want me to do?
Could technology replace central banks? Is that feasible, or is it desirable?
Clearly, I think central bank digital currencies can be centralized and account-based, basically at the retail level, the universal account with the central bank, to the extent that this is technologically superior to current checkable deposit account. I think it should be allowed to compete, and the disintermediation from the banking sector could be compensated for by the central bank simply lending its its deposits, right, out to the commercial banks, replacing commercial bank deposits with commercial bank claim on on the central bank. I'm not completely convinced that central bank digital currencies at the retail level could not be distributed ledger based. I'm not clear on that. It is possible if we get less environmentally destructive consensus mechanisms than the proof of work. If proof of stake or similar things actually are scalable and not easily corrupted technologically, then I think we could well have a decentralized central bank digital currency. But I think this will compete with private digital currencies, and that is a good thing. We could have stable coins convertible into private bank currencies or free floating private currencies that compete as stores of value with the central bank. And I think that might be a healthy competition.
Yeah, it was interesting. We had Professor Fan Gong on about 2 weeks ago. He sits on the Monetary Policy Committee of China, and he expressed fairly candidly he wasn't quite sure what even their CBDC pilot was trying to address. He said they wanted to learn for sure how it might work and function, but he wasn't too sure what problem CBDC solved. Charles?
No, I rather agree with that. I'm something of a skeptic of retail CBDC, though I see that there are weaknesses in the foreign exchange market that could be met. I think the real issue is who is going to create credit and whether you want it centralized in central bank. My answer to that would be no, I don't want it centralized in the central bank. For lots of reasons. I want there to be competition. I want people, if they're turned down by one lender, to be able to go to another lender and try their chance with that. I think that if you're going to centralize the provision of credit, you are along the road towards a more socialist, less private enterprise system than I'd like to see. I'm also concerned about the idea that the central bank could just shift money that it obtains by issuing CBDC back to the commercial banks and then have them lending it out. Because how do they decide which commercial bank to give it to? In particular, there is a great worry that CBDC under normal circumstances wouldn't actually provide much end benefit to a normal retail customer like me that the commercial bank couldn't provide, except when you would start worrying about the solvency of your commercial bank, so that you could easily make the availability of CBDC worsen the intensity of a bank run quite considerably. And then what would the central bank do? To whom would it send back the funds that would pour into it? And because it doesn't want to lose money by sending it to weaker banks. So what happens when there is a run?
Andrew?
Well, I think you summed it up really. I mean, clearly, technologically, you could do it. It would disintermediate the banks, but then you would, and presumably you could do it at a tiny fraction of the cost of commercial banking at the present time, but you'd have to decide what the government is going to do with the money that it accumulates, to which banks will it give it, and what those banks will do, and what return the government will require. There are lots and lots of issues. I mean, it's a solution in search of a problem. And the system at the present time isn't perfect, but it works okay. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And even though it's not perfect, I don't see that central bank digital cash aimed at the retail investor or the retail saver or the retail transactor is really going to be a huge improvement on the system we have at the present time.
Yes. Susan Milton makes a pretty good distinction between the idea here that, yeah, this might be helpful for transactional activities, but not for policy decisions. Shan, we're going to close in a minute, so I'll give you kind of the last word is yours on this question of whether or not technology can replace central banks.
Well, I was inspired by Mervyn King's 1999 speech, and he saw that it could do, but it depended upon creating a tether. And I think this has been a marvelous exercise. Thank you, Professor Alderman Michael Manelli, to show that we need to have get out of old habits of thinking about money and central banks. We've got to start experimenting with new ways of designing the financial system, because the present one has all sorts of problems, and cryptocurrencies are not the solution. So it's been a great exercise of expanding one's mind. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I guess I'd close with just a few comments. I won't try and summarize, but I think we open very much with Charles and co pointing out that these central banks are politically constrained. Andrew's point about independence, they are political constructs, so they'll be independent if they're politically allowed to be and told to be independent. I think we got a primacy from most of the panel that at the moment price stability is what they should be about. I'm conscious that Carney's synthetic hegemonic currency came out at the same time as the central banks were having huge debates about Facebook's, well, then Facebook's Libra. And so there were a lot of interesting responses. And I would argue, frankly, quite a bit of muddled thinking in that. I believe Willem made a very good point, pointing out that backing and tethering are two separate things. They may be somewhat related. And I think that, central banks have too much to do. On this last comment about technology, I'm often floored that most people talk about technology as a two-edged sword. It gives you powers that you didn't have, and you can use them for better or for ill. But one of the things that a central bank digital currency would do would be to allow us to create new taxes almost at will, because you simply go home and algorithmically calculate what you want. And in 2016, I gave an example of such a CBDC-based tax to the House of Lords. I pointed out that given widespread sentiment then around the time of the Brexit vote that London is too overweening, imagine a populist redistribution tax whereby transaction taxes rise in wealthy districts. So, to bring about leveling up, the politicians increase the taxation rate as you approach Trafalgar Square up to 99.9% beside Nelson's Column, or spend your money in the Outer Hebrides at 0.1% tax. And that's the sort of thing that could be created in an afternoon by some populists. So technology cuts two ways. This has been fascinating. And I think, Shan, you tried to pull us all together today to point out that we do need these discussions, even if people aren't quite taken with the idea of tethering. We know that there are problems in the system. And hopefully these types of discussions about what the possibilities are, what the possibilities technology offer, are things that we should keep in mind at all times. But I don't think we'll be changing the operating system of the economies of the Western world very rapidly, and perhaps nor should we. May I thank all of our panelists today. It's been a true delight, because all people I admire, and I'm delighted to have Shan, Andrew, Willem, and Charles here today. And we have to keep this discussion going. Thank you.